Now let's turn to another potential reason that there might be differences in wages for different groups, and that is discrimination. Now, for discrimination, all we really have in mind is differences in workers that are not relevant to productivity in any way. So here we have different workers that belong to different groups, and what group you belong to has nothing to do with your productivity, but there is just some kind of discriminatory, prejudicial attitude toward certain groups of workers and not toward others. Right? Now here, the very important thing to point out is the source of the actual discrimination really does matter when we talk about discrimination and its economic consequences. It is possible for maybe these discriminatory attitudes to exist in the mind of the employer. So it's really the employer that has a dislike for one group and a like for another group. But it's also possible that the customer might be the one that has the discriminatory attitude. Now here I have some notes as to when it's most likely that you would have one or the other. Say employer-based discrimination is much more likely if, say, customers don't interact with employees directly. For example, I have no idea who made my shoes or what they look like. So even if I have discriminatory attitudes, it's not going to have any impact in the market for shoes, unless the employer somehow makes it known to me who their workers are. Now, customer-based discrimination is much more likely where there is some direct interaction between customers and employees. So, for example, I have in mind things like various service industries. So I might care who my barber is or who serves me in a restaurant. Right? So in that case, the customer could be a source of discrimination that employers would take into account when they decide who to hire and who not to hire. So let's look at how each of these would work out and what the economic consequences are. First, employer-based discrimination. So here we're imagining it's really the employer is the one that cares about which group they're hiring from. Now, to make things as general as possible, one group is the privileged group, the other group is the oppressed group. Exactly how we define these groups would depend upon your historical circumstances. Historically, we've seen lots of different groups that have ended up privileged or have ended up oppressed, depending upon the specific case. So here I'm just keeping it as general as possible, and the story will be true anytime that we can say, yes, this group is actually privileged, this group is actually oppressed. And this is, remember, in the employer's mind. The privileged group is just the one that is more preferred, regardless of the fact that they're no more productive compared to the oppressed group. Now, thinking about employer-based discrimination, we would note that the demand for labor from the privileged group would be substantially higher than from the oppressed group. That's simply from the fact that the employer just likes that group better. So they have a higher demand for their labor. As a result of high demand for the labor, wages will be relatively high for the privileged group rather than the oppressed group. So here we can easily see where the difference in wages comes from, just from the fact that the employer has these discriminatory attitudes. They're more likely to hire from the privileged group. The increase in demand for that type of labor drives wages up. So it's a pretty direct story to say how employer-based discrimination results in this difference in wages. However, it would be totally unfair to end the story at this point, because it ends up there is more to come. So what kind of effect does this difference in wages have, say, on something like costs? Well, naturally, if I'm hiring the privileged group, I'm paying higher wages, which means that my costs are going to be higher. While if I were to hire the oppressed group, I would end up with lower costs. Now, because, in this case, the employer is the source of the discrimination, there's no way for the employer to pass on these costs to the consumer. Right? The consumer doesn't care who produces their particular good. They don't have any discrimination, perhaps because they don't know who's producing the thing. Right? As a result, high costs from hiring the privileged group will end up eating into your profits. So we'd end up with relatively low profits from hiring the privileged group, with high profits if we hire the oppressed group. This is extremely important, because what it tells us is that, in effect, the discriminating employer who really just wants to hire this privileged group pays for their discrimination themselves in the form of lower profits. So the conclusion then we can reach that's perfectly reasonable is that profit-seeking entrepreneurs will end up hiring the oppressed group. So really all we need are entrepreneurs who really just care about profits, and they will hop in, hire up the oppressed group, and over time we would expect that to eliminate all the discriminating employers, simply because if I have lower costs, I can undercut you without really hurting my profits that much. So eventually, over time, discrimination should be eliminated, as those that don't discriminate will outcompete those that do discriminate. So employer-based discrimination, while it is something that can result in a difference in wages, at the same time, it is something that isn't stable. It's something we would expect the market to eliminate over time. With customer discrimination, the story is not quite so rosy. So let's go ahead and tell that story. It's a little bit more complicated, but we can get there. So it could hire either the privileged group or the oppressed group. Now remember, in this case, it's really the customer that cares which group you hire from. So that being the case, what's really going to show up is the demand for a product. So if you hire the privileged group, you end up with more customers than if you hire the oppressed group, simply because customers would rather be served by the privileged group. That being the case, we would have higher prices if we hire from the privileged group. As a result, we have a higher demand for the labor from that group, and we have high wages for that group. With the oppressed group, because there's a low demand for the product they produce, they're not going to have very high prices for that product, the demand for their labor will be low, and wages will be low. So we can see that there is already a difference between employer-based discrimination and customer-based discrimination. With employer-based discrimination, there's no difference in prices. With customer-based discrimination, the difference in prices is actually what drives the difference in wages. Now that means then, if we hire the privileged group, we will have high costs. If we hire the oppressed group, we will have low costs. Right? That's exactly the same as we had before. However, in this case, there's no obvious profit advantage either way. If I hire the privileged group, I have high costs, it's true, but at the same time I have high prices to help cover those costs. Whereas if I hire the oppressed group, I do have low costs, that's true, but at the same time I can only charge low prices, so it's very difficult to cover those low costs. As a result, we would expect this type of discrimination to be much more persistent than if it's just employer-based. Well, naturally, this raises the question, right? We don't want to have this difference in wages that comes purely, in effect, at random from people having these strange attitudes that have nothing to do with actual real economic outcomes and productivity. So how can we deal with discrimination? Well, this is a case where it's very tempting to say, well, let's just make a law that says everybody has to be paid the same wage for the same work. Right? Well, with some analysis, we find out that is actually exactly the wrong answer if our goal is to actually eliminate discrimination in the employment process. Right? Here, let's go into why. Right? For employer-based discrimination, we know the market will solve the problem given enough time. All we need really are greedy entrepreneurs that really just care about profit. They'll hop in and outcompete those that really have these prejudicial attitudes. Right? But once you impose equal wage legislation, you eliminate the reason to prefer the oppressed group. Right? Remember, the original story relied on the fact that you can pay the oppressed group somewhat less. That's where the demand for their labor comes from to start with. As a result, if we have equal wage legislation and the employer is really the source of the discrimination, we've just made discrimination more persistent. We've eliminated the incentive for greedy entrepreneurs to hop in and hire up the oppressed group, driving up their wages. So we end up here, now it's true, we couldn't have discrimination in wages anymore, assuming we can actually enforce this equal wage legislation. Instead, what we'd end up with is discrimination hiring quantities rather than wages. So it just ends up that it's far easier for the privileged group to find jobs, while the oppressed group has an extremely difficult time finding jobs. With customer-based discrimination, an equal wage legislation, you might think, well, okay, here there wasn't any reason to prefer the oppressed group to start with. This is going to be a persistent form of discrimination. So let's just go ahead and pass this legislation to at least eliminate that wrongful effect. Well, here we're actually making the problem worse by creating a reason to prefer the privileged group. After all, remember, if I hire from the privileged group, I can charge higher prices because the customer is very willing to pay more to be served by that group. As a result, if I iron out the cost of hiring these two, I end up with higher profits from hiring the privileged group. So in that case, we make discrimination even more prevalent than it would be in the absence of equal wage legislation. Right? Now here, once again, the discrimination can't show up in wages, but it shows up again in quantities, and that it's very easy for the privileged group to find a job, extremely difficult for the group that is being discriminated against to have a job. Now, some evidence for this. Now, the reality is that any sort of equal wage legislation that we actually have in the West tends to be extremely difficult to enforce because it's remarkably difficult to show that two persons' work is equal. But there is one case where equal wage legislation does actually exist, and that's with minimum wages. Minimum wages for unskilled workers. Right? The minimum wage is a flat minimum that everyone has to be paid regardless of their identity. Well, it ends up, when we look at those that are most likely to be paid the minimum wage, that would be teenagers, we find there's extremely persistent unemployment rate differences when you look at, say, Caucasian American versus African American males. Here, I had to use males because that's the data you can get going back a few decades. So when you look into it, you look at the difference between their rates, you find out that African American teen males have about twice the unemployment rate as Caucasian American teen males do. Right? And that was true roughly 40 years ago. It was a little over twice, it was something like 2.2 times. The unemployment rate was about 2.2 times as high for the African American group as for the Caucasian American group. And then more recently, it's been something closer to 1.9 times. Right? So we see that there is this very persistent difference in unemployment rates, despite the fact that I think it's fair to say that in the United States, we've had a significant change in attitudes regarding the acceptability of discrimination. Yet, despite the fact that our attitudes have changed, the economic outcomes haven't changed that much. This suggests that there's something in there that's preventing this process from actually occurring. It's at least reasonable to think that part of the story might be that equal wage legislation is creating a barrier that is actually creating a preference for the privileged group.